Contemporary fashion discourse can be defined by social media-driven microtrends and very specific stylistic identities. And while certain styles have changed over time, the modern obsession with embodying a certain aesthetic for American fashion can be traced back to the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl was the personified feminine ideal from the 1890s to the early 1910s, and is credited for introducing a unified beauty standard for American women, the first of what would become many. While earlier generations of women looked up to British and French aristocracy for beauty ideals, the Gibson Girl was a standard of beauty that felt distinctly American and contemporary. This is the beginning of a new series where we look into specific archetypes and style trends through the decades, and the cultural context of how these ideals came to be. And making the series is going to be a walk in the park because I will be using Wondershare. I edit all my long and short form content using Wondershare. It's intuitive and beginner friendly, but you can still create professional quality videos. If you want to start making your own content with an easy to use editor, you can click my affiliate link in the description. The legacy of the Gibson Girl lives today not only as examples of soft dramatics and Kibbe analysis, but also as the inspiration for an ice cream parlor in Disneyland. And 1 century later, high fashion runways took inspiration from this archetype. Who exactly was the Gibson Girl, and how did she go from an illustration of a woman with swept-up hair to an era-defining style icon? We're going to explore the cultural backdrop that created the Gibson Girl, and look into the fashion trends that were associated with the style. So now, let's get started. Okay, so it's the 1890s. What was going on? This was the era of the Second Industrial Revolution, which sparked massive social and technological change. Jobs in factories, construction, and office work were concentrated in large cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. For reference for how fast cities were developing, in 1850, only 15% of Americans lived in an urban area. By 1900, this number would more than double to over 40%. For leisure and entertainment, people were switching their old-fashioned high-wheelers for the new and modern safety bikes. In Paris, the Moulin Rouge would become world famous for a scandalous performance known as the Can-Can. Coca-Cola just entered the market, making soft drinks a popular refreshment. In their early stages, these drinks were also made with powdered candy, and women contributed to the popularity of all these trends. With urbanization providing more opportunities for formal education and professional work, a growing number of women were earning income and became more economically independent compared to previous generations. This led to the concept of the new woman, a term coined by writer Henry James. This ideal was best described in Alice Freeman Palmer, The Evolution of a New Woman, as women of affluence and sensitivity who, despite or perhaps because of their wealth, exhibited an independent spirit and were accustomed to acting on their own. These new urban, upper-class women were no longer confined to the domestic sphere, but were becoming more visible on a daily basis, whether it be riding safety bicycles in Central Park, going to the beach, or shopping in department stores. Illustrator Charles Dana Gibson captured the shift in 1891 by creating the Gibson Girl, which he described as a composite of thousands of American girls. He would draw countless images of these imagined contemporary women for Life magazine, cementing the Gibson Girl as a visual symbol of the end of the Victorian period and the beginning of the Edwardian era. Charles Gibson explains, "I'll tell you how I got what you have called the Gibson Girl. I saw her on the streets. I saw her at the theaters. I saw her in the churches. I saw her everywhere and doing everything. There isn't any Gibson Girl, but there are many thousands of American girls, and for that, let us all thank God." The Gibson Girl was a carefully crafted image. She was a young, upper-middle-class, English-American woman who wore only the trendiest fashions. The ideal physicality of the Gibson Girl was being tall and slender, with an hourglass figure. A Gibson Girl may even attend college. After all, she is bright, confident, and valued independence. However, she would never associate with the suffragettes. She was also characterized by her interactions with men. She had a flirtatious personality, but was foremost in control in romantic situations. Pretty much every guy was into her and did whatever she wanted. There was one illustration where a Gibson Girl ordered 2 guys to plant a tree the wrong way, only because she told them to. She must have been watching those divine femininity videos. The Gibson Girls were associated with specific style trends that were distinctive in their era. These signature looks embodied the ideal, starting with bouffant hairstyles. One of the defining aspects of the Gibson Girl aesthetic was a voluminous, fluffy updo. As mentioned before, the beauty standard for the Gibson Girl was being tall, and this style can visually add some height. In comparison to the more rigid Victorian ringlets, the Gibson Girl style of swept-up hair was soft, relaxed, and gave off a romantic appeal. This look was achieved by dividing the hair by the front and back and twisting the two sections into a bun. Adding hair cushions for extra volume were optional. No rubber bands or hairspray were used to create the style. It was held together with U-shaped hairpins and/or bobby pins, and as long as you didn't mess with it too much, it'll be secured for the day. Shirtwaists. Also known as simply waists, these were unlined blouses made of cotton or linen fabric, typically adorned with embroidery or lace. They were almost always paired with a long skirt, which allowed for mobility and comfort, shifting away from the restrictive hoop skirts and heavy bustles. Because this was a common look for women in professional workspaces, shirtwaists became a symbol of the new woman archetype, which in turn was associated with Gibson girls. While not necessarily a piece of formal wear, these were the shirts you'd see every day during this time. Choker necklaces. The choker look was a continuation of late Victorian trends, but were well suited for Gibson girls for complementing the desired look of an elegant long neck. The most common type of chokers were black ribbons, but pearl and bead chokers were also in vogue. This style was pretty flirtatious, without clashing with the social norms of modesty and decorum. Lingerie dresses. This did not refer to underwear. These dresses were called so to reference its thin and light fabric. Lingerie dresses were a common daywear look and were frequently worn for outdoor activity. They were almost always white or in a soft pastel color, making this style of dress easier to wash compared to others. Walking suits. These suits were another trend that reflected the new emphasis for mobility in women's fashion, since they were practical for activities like bicycling. This style took some inspiration from men's fashion of the time, but the shorter jacket and rounded shape still looked feminine. Hats. Big ones. Commonly referred to as cartwheel hats, this trend embodied the maximalism of the turn of the century, while also being a good way to maintain the aforementioned trendy hairstyles. Large-brimmed hats were more expensive, so the bigger the hat, the greater the status symbol. Some designs would extend over the wearer's shoulders, and the more embellishments it had, the better. In some extreme cases, these hats would weigh up to 50 pounds and were kept steady with hat pins. Popular decorations included feathers, ribbons, artificial flowers, and in some cases, stuffed birds. The bird ornaments would commonly be sprinkled with arsenic, or rat poison, to preserve the design. This bird and hat trend was so popular, it affected the global bird population, and even caused some species, such as the snowy egret, to nearly go extinct. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 and changing fashion trends would thankfully bring an end to this style, but the issue of animals being hunted in the name of luxury was far from over. S-bend silhouettes. The silhouette was created by a new style of corsets designed by physician and corsetier Inez Gachet-Sarrou, also known as safety corsets. These undergarments entered the market in the early 1900s and were marketed as a safer alternative to the Victorian hourglass corset, since it put less pressure on the abdomen. However, the construction caused the wearer to lean forward, emphasizing the bust, and the back was pushed really back, giving an S-shaped figure. Again, hourglass silhouettes were the beauty standard, but safety corsets took it to the extreme. Stage actress Camille Clifford was known as the quintessential Gibson Girl, and was also famous for her 18-inch waist, which was made even smaller through image manipulation. But the general public still believed these images were real. If you were a turn-of-the-century woman and wanted to achieve this look, you could try taking a tapeworm pill, which allegedly contained a tapeworm egg. It's still not certain if these products were real. Some reports stated that the tapeworm diet was a complete scam, with the pill only containing sugar, but at worst, these pills were extremely dangerous. This was by no means a common practice. It was definitely sensationalized, but it still comes to show that people undergoing extreme practices to follow a certain beauty standard is nothing new. Parasols. These were a must-have accessory if you wanted to be considered fashionable, but they were also necessary. Imagine you're wearing a hat that weighs roughly 10, 20, 50 pounds, and you're wearing a corset that's making you walk like a pigeon. Parasols were needed to stop you from toppling over, but they were decorative, often covered in lace, or could be color coordinated with the outfit. But foremost, parasols revealed that whoever sported them was a member of the upper or middle class. Off-shoulder tops. This was not a very popular trend, but was still visible, especially by model Evelyn Nesbit, who was photographed wearing off-shoulder cuts, and was idealized as a real-life Gibson girl by Charles Gibson. the style was reserved for evening formal wear and sort of predicted the infamous cold shoulder tops of the 2010s. The Gibson Girl fashion trends captured the spirit of the new woman with a stylish twist. They were independent and socially visible, but still had an air of traditional femininity. During the 1910s, the Gibson Girl style was beginning to fade away, with the influence of designer Paul Poiret, who moved away from corset-friendly designs. And by the start of World War I, trends that Gibson girls were known for, such as extravagant hats and lush, detailed dress designs, were quickly replaced by minimalistic styles due to material shortages and economic constraints. We'll explore these changes in more detail in the next episode of the series. While we can admire and take inspiration from the Gibson Girl aesthetic, it was still built on the restrictive and exclusionary values of this era. While women of varying ethnicities and social classes were slaying Gibson Girl fashion, the ideal that Charles Gibson created was a woman who specifically appeared English American and had no recent immigrants in her family. And to create the fashion associated with Gibson girls, the people who worked in clothing factories often endured 12 to 14-hour shifts 6 days a week and were severely underpaid for their labor. And according to a 1900 report, roughly 20% of these workers were children. There were no labor rights or protections for factory workers, which would lead to disaster in 1911. The shirtwaist trend was the center of one of the most horrific industrial workplace tragedies in American history. As a result of this, new laws and regulations were introduced for factories, including fire drills, sprinkler systems, and limitations on work hours. And going back to the Gibson Girl, the vibe I'm getting from Charles Gibson was that he was just illustrating his fantasy, an imagined concept of upper middle class American women. But his drawings foremost captured the spirit of the turn of the century. While the Gibson Girl started off with simple portraits of women's faces, the public would see these images and had an idea of who these women were, which could only be truly understood if you lived in that era. It's like how we can see images like these and know they're embodying the clean girl aesthetic. The Gibson Girl was more than just drawings. These were visual shorthands that symbolized an increasingly changing world. And that's all I have for looking into the Gibson Girl. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.